Thomas's family had lived on the same farmland for over a century. The land wasn't just acres of soil and trees. It was a storybook of his family's legacy. At the center of it all was the creek. It wound gently across the property like a silver ribbon, sparkling under the sun, whispering in the evenings, and roaring proudly during storms. His grandfather had built a small wooden bridge over it decades earlier, and his father had taught him to fish for trout in its pools. Local wildlife, deer, foxes, herons, relied on its water. To Thomas, the creek was more than land. It was life, history, and memory intertwined. On summer evenings, Thomas would sit on its banks with his loyal hound, listening to crickets and frogs while sipping sweet tea. That creek had seen generations grow, laugh, and cry. But in one cruel season, all of that peace was threatened when the HOA from the neighboring subdivision decided that nature itself was inconvenient. The subdivision up the hill was a place Thomas had always avoided. Gleaming SUVs filled the driveways, lawns looked like golf courses, and homeowners competed over whose roses bloomed brightest. They called themselves the community, but Thomas saw through their pretentious smiles. They were ruled by Claire, the HOA president, a woman who carried herself like royalty and spoke as if she owned the valley. Claire believed the creek was an eyesore. At HOA meetings, she complained that the water looked muddy after rains, and she insisted it ruined the view from their walking trails. Her solution was outrageous: fill the creek with concrete, straighten its path, and turn it into a paved walkway lined with flower beds. Realtors promised it would boost curb appeal and raise property values. Homeowners clapped at the idea, blinded by Claire's confidence and the lure of higher prices. Not one person questioned whether the creek was theirs to control, or what would happen if they choked the valley's lifeline. When the construction crews arrived, Thomas was bewildered. Dump trucks backed onto his land, and workers in neon vests began laying boards to guide cement mixers toward the creek. He stormed out, waving his arms. "What are you doing on my property?" he demanded. One worker shrugged. "Orders from the HOA. We're improving the area." Before he could argue further, Claire appeared, clipboard in hand, her sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. She smirked as if Thomas were nothing more than an obstacle. "This is for the greater good," she said smoothly. "Your little ditch won't be missed." "It's a creek and it's mine," Thomas snapped. Claire rolled her eyes. "Don't be difficult. We're adding value to this community. You should be thanking us." Thomas stood frozen as truck after truck poured thick gray cement into the flowing water. The sound of trickling life turned into a suffocated gurgle. Fish flopped helplessly, birds circled overhead, and the creek that had carried generations' memories was buried alive under a cold, lifeless slab. For a brief moment, the HOA celebrated. They held a ribbon-cutting ceremony, complete with champagne glasses and smiling photos. Homeowners strutted along their scenic walkway, marveling at how modern it looked. Realtors praised the project, calling it a bold step forward for property values. But then came the first storm. Rain pounded the valley for 2 days. Normally, the creek would swell, catch the water, and guide it downstream like a seasoned guardian. But now, the water had no escape. It pooled against the concrete, overflowed into lawns, and seeped into basements. At first, residents brushed it off as bad weather. But the storms didn't stop. Every rainfall grew worse. Patios flooded, backyard pools turned brown, and water crept toward foundations. One morning, Thomas stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching as expensive stone driveways shimmered under 6 inches of standing water. The once celebrated walkway was submerged, cracked, and crumbling. Nature had begun its slow but certain revenge. 5 weeks turned into months, and the subdivision transformed into something out of a nightmare. The water didn't drain. It lingered, stagnant and foul. Mosquitoes bred in clouds, driving families indoors. Gardens rotted, children couldn't play. Outside, and homeowners started calling their insurance companies in panic. Property values dropped like stones. Realtors stopped returning calls. The HOA board received angry letters daily, claims of mold, ruined basements, and destroyed landscapes. What was once a million-dollar neighborhood now looked like a swampy graveyard of bad decisions. Inside the HOA office, tension boiled. "Claire, you promised this would raise our values," one homeowner shouted during a meeting. Claire's confident smile had vanished. She stammered excuses about unpredictable weather and temporary setbacks. But the residents weren't buying it anymore. The community that once worshipped her leadership now demanded answers and compensation. While chaos consumed the neighborhood, Thomas worked quietly but relentlessly. He photographed every trespassing truck, documented the cement pours, and collected property surveys showing the creek's boundaries. He consulted environmental experts, who confirmed that damming a natural creek without permits was illegal and destructive. But the jewel in his evidence came from a chance encounter. One evening, while confronting Claire again, she snapped at him. "We decided to take control of the creek. You can complain all you want, but the HOA runs this neighborhood, not you." Unbeknownst to her, Thomas had been recording. That one sentence captured her arrogance, her disregard for ownership, and her willful decision to overstep the law. It was the nail in the coffin. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the day of the trial. On one side sat the HOA board, dressed in suits, flanked by expensive attorneys. On the other side sat Thomas, calm but resolute, with binders of evidence stacked neatly in front of him. Behind him sat dozens of homeowners, some angry, some desperate, some silently rooting for the farmer who had dared to stand up to the board. Thomas's attorney painted a vivid picture, photos of the thriving creek before, maps proving ownership, expert testimony about environmental harm, and statements from residents describing their flooded misery. The jury leaned forward as every piece of evidence mounted. Then came the recording. The courtroom grew silent as Claire's voice echoed, "We decided to take control of the creek." Her arrogance was undeniable. Even her own board members looked away in shame. By the end, the HOA's defense collapsed under the weight of their own recklessness. The verdict was swift and crushing. The judge declared the HOA guilty of trespassing, property destruction, and environmental negligence. They were ordered to pay millions in damages to Thomas and restitution to the homeowners whose properties had been ruined. Even worse for the HOA, they were tasked with funding the full restoration of the creek, no matter how expensive. The news spread quickly. Local media covered the HOA swamp disaster, and homeowners across the county whispered cautionary tales about arrogance and greed. Claire resigned in disgrace, disappearing from public view. The HOA was left in shambles, drowning in lawsuits and debts. Their once prized neighborhood was now infamous, mocked online as million-dollar swampland. It took months of grueling work, but eventually crews arrived to undo the damage. The concrete was broken apart and hauled away. The natural waterbed was reshaped, banks were reinforced, and the creek slowly breathed again. Thomas watched with pride as fish returned, reeds swayed in the current, and the familiar murmur of flowing water filled the valley once more. Standing on the wooden bridge his grandfather built, Thomas smiled. His land had been scarred, but it had survived. The subdivision behind him, however, remained half empty, its reputation ruined. Families moved away, leaving behind hollow shells of once grand homes. For Thomas, it was never about revenge. It was about respect. For the land, for history, for nature. The creek was alive again, and with it, so was his peace. The HOA had tried to bury it under concrete, but in the end, nature and justice had both flowed back stronger than ever.